The storm that emptied the county had already killed 3 power lines and 1 bridge by the time the call reached Jack Brennan's shop. Every other tow operator had made the same decision, but Jack was already pulling his flatbed onto the road, his daughter asleep beside him with a book and a flashlight. The woman waiting in the ditch drove a vehicle her own company had built, and she did not know yet that it was trying to kill her. What Jack found under that SUV at 2 in the morning was not a flat tire or a dead battery. It was the reason she would later stand in his garage and offer him anything he wanted. Jack Brennan woke at 5:30 every morning without an alarm because his body had learned the rhythm of responsibility so thoroughly that it no longer required instruction. He moved through the small living quarters behind the shop in a particular order that had not changed in 3 years. Coffee first, then oatmeal on the stove, then 3 quiet knocks on the door at the end of the short hallway. The knocks were never louder than necessary, and Sophie always answered them the same way. A small groan, then the shuffle of feet, then the door opened to reveal an 8-year-old with tangled hair and serious eyes that took in the world with the wordless trust of a girl who had never been given a reason to doubt. Their building sat on the eastern edge of Millbrook, a single-story structure with 2 bays, a gravel lot that turned to mud when the rain came hard, and a living space in the rear that had once been a storage closet before Jack converted it. The neighbors did not know much about him, except that his shop was not the cheapest in the county, and that he was the one people called when the job was actually hard. They knew he had a daughter who rode with him sometimes on weekends, and they knew that the sign above the door had been painted by hand in block letters that were already starting to fade. What they did not know was that Jack had once worked at Prescott Motorsport Restorations, where he had built chassis for vehicles that now sat in private collections across 3 states. He had left that world 8 years ago, not because he lacked the skill, but because Sophie's mother had walked out one Tuesday afternoon without explanation, and Jack had understood that the life he had been living was no longer available to him. He had chosen stability over prestige, oatmeal over restaurant dinners, and a garage in Millbrook over a reputation in circles where reputations were currency. He did not regret the choice because regret was a luxury that required time he did not have, but he sometimes noticed the way his hands remembered work they no longer performed. The hands themselves told the story before he ever opened his mouth. The palms were calloused in patterns that matched specific tools, and the knuckles carried engine grease that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. He wore a work jacket with a torn left pocket that he kept meaning to stitch, and boots that had been resoled 4 times because new boots required breaking in, and breaking in required blisters, and blisters slowed him down. These details were not signs of poverty. They were signs of a man who allocated his resources according to a hierarchy that made sense only to him. Sophie understood this without being told. She had learned to read her father's silence the way other children read moods, and she knew the difference between the silence of concentration and the silence that formed when he was thinking about something he did not yet have words for. She also knew about the photograph above the workbench, the one that showed a suspension assembly from his Prescott days, hung deliberately crooked in a frame that had cost him $2 at a yard sale. She had asked once why he did not straighten it, and he had said, because the person who took it never worried about straight lines. He did not ask again. On the morning the storm arrived, Jack moved through his routine with the unhurried precision of a man who understood that the work would come whether he rushed toward it or not. He made Sophie's lunch, checked her homework folder, and walked her to the bus stop at the end of the gravel drive. The bus came at 7:20, and Sophie climbed the steps without looking back, which was their agreement. Jack watched the bus until it turned onto the county road, and then he walked back to the shop and opened the first bay door to let in the gray morning light. The weather report had called for rain by afternoon, and the wind was already carrying the smell of it, that particular heaviness that settled into the lungs before the first drops fell. The storm arrived in 3 stages. First came the wind, strong enough to peel branches from the oaks and send them skittering across the road surfaces. Then came the rain, heavy enough to close the interstate by 6 o'clock. turning the back roads into glass and the drainage ditches into temporary rivers. Finally came the temperature drop, the one that transformed standing water into ice on bridges and low spots before most drivers realized they had already lost traction. Calls came into the shop with the rhythm of the storm's escalation. A delivery truck off Route 9, a sedan that refused to start in the supermarket lot, a minivan at hydroplaned near Mill Creek. Jack handled each call methodically, loading Sophie into the truck's passenger seat with a book and a flashlight because the babysitter could not make it through the flooded roads that separated her house from the shop. Sophie did not complain. She had grown accustomed to the rhythm of her father's work, and she understood that the truck's cab was, on certain nights, an extension of their home. She read her book under the dome light and only looked up when the winch engaged, or when her father's posture changed in the driver's seat, which meant the job was harder than it had first appeared. The final call came at 10:47 p.m., routed through the county dispatcher who hesitated before reading the details. The vehicle was a luxury SUV, stuck in a drainage ditch off Old Quarry Road, the kind of road that didn't appear on most GPS maps and shouldn't have been driven in weather like this. The dispatcher's voice carried the reluctance of a man who already knew the answer to his own question, and Jack understood before the sentence was finished that 3 other tow companies had already refused. The location was too remote, the approach too steep, the liability too high. Jack did not ask who the driver was or what they were willing to pay. He asked only 2 questions. Is the ditch filling with water? And is the driver still inside the vehicle? The dispatcher confirmed both, and Jack said he would be there in 20 minutes. He hung up the phone and looked at Sophie, who had set her book down, and was watching him with the expression she reserved for moments when she understood that the ordinary rules of the evening were about to change. She asked if she could come, and Jack said no, then reconsidered, because leaving her alone in the shop during a storm that was tearing power lines from poles was its own calculation of risk. The compromise was the same one they had reached on other nights like this. Sophie would ride in the tow truck's cab, wrapped in the wool blanket that lived behind the passenger seat, with her book and her flashlight and the small red toy toolbox she insisted on carrying. Jack checked the truck's chains, the winch cable, the brake lights, and the tire pressure, with the same methodical attention he applied to every departure, because the ritual of checking was the ritual of a man who understood that most disasters began with the assumption that everything was fine. Sophie climbed into the cab and buckled herself in without being told, and Jack pulled the flatbed onto the county road with the wipers at maximum speed and the headlights catching nothing but water. The drive to Old Quarry Road took 19 minutes. The rain was coming down hard enough to collapse the distinction between the road and the ditches alongside it, and the truck's tires sent up wakes that broke against the guardrails. Sophie did not speak. She watched the road through the windshield with the same serious expression she applied to math problems, and Jack drove with both hands on the wheel and his eyes scanning the shoulders, the tree line, and the particular way the water moved across the asphalt. He did not think about who was waiting in the ditch. He thought about angles, traction, and the weight distribution of a loaded flatbed on a grade that was already slicker than it looked. The headlights found her at 11:17 p.m., though Jack wouldn't remember the exact time until later. The SUV sat nose down in a drainage ditch that was rapidly becoming a stream, the front wheels buried in mud that had already swallowed the hubcaps, the rear wheels lifted completely off the ground by the angle of the descent. Water rushed past the driver's side door with enough force to make opening it dangerous, and the vehicle's hazard lights strobed against the rain in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, a desperate signal in a landscape that had emptied of everything except the storm and the 2 people caught in it. Jack recognized the vehicle before he recognized the person standing beside it. It was a Cross CX-90, the flagship of the Cross Automotive Group, a machine that Jack knew not from envy, but from technical curiosity. He had read the service bulletins and studied the chassis specifications. He did not think about any of this as he stepped from the truck into the ring. He thought about the physics of the extraction, the softening mud, the uneven weight distribution, and the angle of pull that would bring the vehicle back onto the road without rolling it sideways into the deepening water. The woman standing beside the stranded SUV wasn't what Jack expected, though he had not consciously formed an expectation. She was in her mid-40s, wearing a tailored wool coat that was already soaked through to the lining, and she had made the practical decision to wear boots rather than the heels that her corporate position probably demanded on ordinary days. She held a small emergency umbrella that was doing almost nothing against the rain's volume, and her phone was pressed to her ear in a posture that suggested she was arguing with someone about a replacement car that couldn't reach her for 3 hours because the same storm that had stranded her had closed the roads in every direction. She did not look frightened. She looked impatient, which was a different, and in some ways more complicated, emotion to encounter in a drainage ditch at 11 p.m. When Jack approached, she lowered the phone and looked at him with the assessing gaze of a person who is accustomed to evaluating competence in seconds and making decisions based on those evaluations. She opened her mouth to speak, probably to explain who she was, to name her company, to establish the priority that her position demanded. Jack did not give her the chance. He asked 3 questions in the same order he always asked them. Are you hurt? The vehicle in park? Have you engaged the parking brake? She was thrown by the order of the questions, and Jack saw the momentary confusion cross her face before her executive reflexes reasserted themselves. She answered yes, yes, and yes, and then she began to explain that she was Vivian Cross, that she needed the vehicle operational by morning, that she had a board meeting that couldn't be rescheduled, and that she expected the work to be handled with discretion. Jack listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said only that he needed to walk the scene before he could tell her anything about timelines. He took his flashlight from his belt and began moving around the vehicle in a slow circle, his boots sinking into the mud at the ditch's edge, his eyes tracking not the damage but the geometry of the situation. The tow was not straightforward. The ditch was softening with every minute of rain. The SUV's center of gravity had shifted forward, and the mud was compacting around the front wheels in a way that would create suction when he tried to pull. A direct extraction risked rolling the vehicle, which would submerge the passenger compartment. Jack spent 4 minutes walking the scene, his flashlight playing across the ground, his mind calculating angles and load distribution with the unconscious ease of a man who had internalized physics through repetition. Vivian watched from beneath her useless umbrella, and Sophie watched from the truck's cab, and neither of them looked away. When Jack returned to the truck, he did not explain his plan. He simply began setting the chains, attaching them to the SUV's designated tow points, and he ran the winch cable at an angle that looked counterintuitive until the physics of it became clear. He talked to the truck the way some men talk to horses, low and steady and specific. The SUV moved in increments, first an inch, then 3, then 6, the mud releasing its hold with a sucking sound. Jack adjusted the cable tension 3 times, redistributing the load, and when the rear wheels touched solid ground, he brought it up slowly until the SUV sat on the road's shoulder. Only then did he cut the winch and step down. Vivian Cross looked at the vehicle as if she were seeing it for the first time, and perhaps she was. She had been arguing with her phone, managing the inconvenience of her situation as an executive manages any disruption. Now she stood in the rain beside a machine that her own engineers had designed, and Jack saw something change in her posture, a slight relaxation of the shoulders that suggested she had not been as certain of her safety as her voice had claimed. She looked at Jack, then at Sophie, who was visible through the cab's rain-streaked glass, with her eyes on the scene outside. Vivian did not ask about the child. She climbed into the truck's cab at Jack's gesture, squeezing onto the bench seat beside Sophie, with the damp wool coat steaming in the warmth of the heater, and she was quiet, for the first time since Jack had arrived. The ride back to Millbrook took 23 minutes. Vivian tried twice to make conversation about the truck's age, its mileage, the obvious fact that Jack's equipment was not the newest she had seen. Jack answered each question with facts rather than defensiveness, naming the year, the model, the engine hours, and the date of the last transmission service. Vivian stopped asking questions after the second exchange, and the cab fell into a silence broken only by the wipers and the heater. Sophie, after studying Vivian for several minutes, reached into her coat pocket and produced a travel pack of tissues, which she held out without a word. Vivian took them and said, "Thank you," and she did not speak again until the truck pulled into the gravel lot. Jack unloaded the SUV in the first bay with the same methodical attention he had applied to the extraction, checking the undercarriage with a shop light as the flatbed lowered the vehicle to the concrete. The asymmetry he had noticed on the roadside was visible now that the SUV sat on a level surface, the left rear sitting 3/4 of an inch lower than the right, even with the vehicle empty and the suspension at rest. It wasn't a dramatic difference, and most drivers wouldn't have noticed it, but Jack had spent too many years reading vehicles to ignore a measurement that didn't match the design specification. He filed the observation away and continued the unloading, his mind already moving ahead to the inspection he would conduct once Vivian Cross was no longer standing in his bay, with rain still dripping from her coat. Vivian, however, had no intention of waiting quietly. She needed the SUV ready by morning, a requirement she restated with the calm certainty of a person who had never been told no by someone she considered beneath her notice. She offered to pay double the standard rate if Jack worked through the night. She offered to have her company's fleet service send a flatbed to retrieve the vehicle immediately. She spoke as if these were generous solutions to a problem that Jack was too small to solve himself. And she did not understand yet that she was negotiating with a man who did not negotiate about certain things. Jack listened to both offers, and once she finished, he told her that the vehicle was not moving tonight. Not because he wanted to keep it, but because something under the rear suspension was not sitting right, and he did not release a vehicle he had not inspected. His tone wasn't confrontational. It was the tone of a man stating a fact that he had already verified internally. Vivian's expression shifted to a more guarded assessment, the look of an executive encountering an unexpected variable. She named a price for a basic tow and release, framing it as fair compensation, and she waited for him to accept. Jack did not accept. He told her again that the inspection was not negotiable, and he picked up a torque wrench and walked to the rear of the SUV. He checked the visible suspension bolts in front of her, 2 on the left mount and 2 on the right, and the wrench clicked on the left side at a setting that was lower than it should have been. Not stripped, not damaged by the ditch, but loose, beyond factory spec. Vivian did not understand exactly what she was seeing, but she recognized the difference between a man performing for an audience and a man who had expected to find something. Jack showed her the torque reading without commentary, and she looked at the numbers without knowing what they meant, but she understood that he was not inventing problems. Sophie appeared in the doorway that connected the shop to the living quarters, wearing pajamas and holding a cup of water she had gotten for herself from the kitchen. She looked at the SUV with the same serious focus she applied to homework, then at Vivian with the directness that children possess and adults have learned to suppress, and finally at her father, who was still on one knee beside the rear wheel. Jack told her to go back to bed without looking up from his work, and Sophie said, "The picture's crooked," Jack said. "I know," and Sophie nodded and left. Vivian said nothing about the picture, but she watched Sophie leave with an expression that Jack would remember later. A look that was not quite sentiment and not quite calculation, but something in between that suggested she was seeing an arrangement of parent and child that did not match her experience. The night deepened around the shop, the rain still drumming against the metal roof in a rhythm that made conversation unnecessary. Jack continued his inspection with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove, and Vivian Cross stood in the corner of the bay with her damp coat steaming under the shop heater, watching a tow truck driver work on her flagship vehicle with a thoroughness that her own service centers had somehow failed to match. She did not know yet what he would find, and she did not know what she would do when he found it, but she understood for the first time that night that she was not in a room where her position or her money established the rules. She was in a garage in Millbrook, and the man on the creeper beneath her SUV had decided that the vehicle would not leave until he was finished with it, and his decision wasn't available for purchase at any price she had yet named. At 2 in the morning, Jack rolled under the vehicle with a creeper and a shop light, and the real story began. He did not start with the damage from the ditch. He started with the asymmetry, the 3/4-inch difference in ride height that he had noticed during the unloading, and he traced it backward through the rear suspension like a man following a blood trail to its source. The left rear sat lower than the right with the vehicle empty, which meant the issue was not in the springs or the shock absorbers components that would have shown other symptoms. The difference was structural, located somewhere in the mounting geometry that held the rear subframe to the unibody, and Jack suspected before he looked that the problem would be invisible to anyone who did not remove the panel that covered it. He removed the rear underbody splash guard, the plastic panel that most quick service centers left in place during routine oil changes and tire rotations, because removing it added time to a job that was already priced too low to accommodate thoroughness. Behind it, hidden from standard visual inspection and unaffected by the electronic diagnostic scanner that Vivian's fleet director had probably already run remotely, Jack found what he had expected to find but had hoped he would not. The rear suspension mounting point, the structural location where the subframe bolted to the unibody, showed stress fractures along the load path that were visible only because the panel was gone and the light was aimed at the correct angle. The fractures were not new. Jack knew this because the oxidation at their edges was darker than fresh metal, which meant they had been growing for months, loaded and unloaded, with every mile of highway driving in a cycle of stress and release. The factory fault code reader would not have detected this because there was no sensor monitoring structural integrity at that location. A visual inspection at a service center would not have caught it because the panel was in place and the cracks were on the upper surface of the mount. Only someone who knew to look there, who understood that electronic diagnostics had blind spots where human attention was required, would have seen what Jack was seeing now. The implications assembled themselves in his mind with the cold clarity of a man who had seen catastrophic failures before. This was not a wear issue. It was a design or manufacturing defect in the load path, a weakness that had propagated under normal driving conditions until the mount was holding on by a fraction of its original strength. Under sustained highway load at speed, the mount could fail catastrophically, the subframe could drop, and the driver would have no warning and no time to respond. Vivian Cross, CEO of the company that had built this vehicle, had been driving a car that could have killed her without ever flashing a warning light. Jack did not rush. He documented everything with photographs, using his phone's camera with the shop light, providing consistent illumination, and he recorded measurements with a caliper to establish the crack dimensions for comparison. He wrote notes in the logbook he kept for every major job, a habit from his Prescott days that had survived the transition to Millbrook because some habits were not about prestige but about survival. The rain continued against the roof, a steady percussion that seemed to mark time rather than pass it, and Jack worked with the steady patience of a man who knew that what he wrote down tonight might be read by lawyers tomorrow. Vivian had fallen asleep in the folding chair, her coat draped over her shoulders like a blanket, and her head tilted at an angle that would leave a crick in her neck when she woke. Jack did not wake her immediately. He finished his documentation, replaced the panel loosely without fastening it, and sat on the creeper for a moment, looking at the vehicle above him. The machine that represented millions of dollars in engineering and marketing and manufacturing pride. And he thought about the gap between what technology could detect and what a trained human eye could see. Then he stood, walked to the chair, and said her name quietly, the way a person states a fact they find neither satisfying nor entertaining. She woke with the immediate alertness of a person who had trained herself to transition from sleep to decision without the intermediate stage of confusion, and she looked at Jack with the same assessing gaze she had used in the ditch, though the context had shifted so completely that the gaze no longer fit. Jack explained what he had found without drama or elaboration, using the same factual precision he applied to torque readings and alignment measurements. He told her the crack was old, that it had grown over months, that the ditch had loaded the suspension unevenly and accelerated a failure that was already in progress, and that if she had hit a pothole at 70 miles per hour the following morning, The Mount could have let go with consequences that did not require imagination to visualize. He did not say, "You would have died." He did not need to. Vivian's reaction wasn't fear. It was a different emotion entirely, the particular silence of someone who had built a company on the promise of engineering excellence, and who was now looking at physical evidence that her product had nearly killed its own chief executive. She looked at the photograph Jack showed her, then at the vehicle, then at Jack, and she didn't speak for a long moment, because there was no executive playbook for this moment, no protocol that covered standing in a garage at 3 in the morning while a tow truck driver showed you that your flagship vehicle was structurally unsound. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the rain, and Jack let it stretch, because some silences were doing work that words could not do. Vivian made a phone call at 3:15 a.m. that Jack didn't hear the beginning of because she had stepped outside into the rain to speak with her fleet director. Within 20 minutes, the director called back with a solution. They could have a flatbed at the shop by 6 a.m., take the vehicle to the company's private testing facility, run a full diagnostic, and determine next steps with the engineering division. The director assured Vivian that this was standard protocol and that the local operator should be compensated generously for his time and discretion. Vivian relayed the offer to Jack with the efficiency of a person who had built her career on the assumption that every problem had a price. She named a figure for the tow that was 3 times the standard rate, added a flat fee for the overnight storage, and mentioned a non-disclosure agreement that her legal team could draft within the hour. The vehicle would leave at dawn, the matter would be handled internally, and Jack's involvement would end with a signed receipt. Her tone was not unkind. It was efficient. This was how problems were managed in her world. Jack let her finish, and then he said simply that the vehicle was not moving. Not because he wished to keep it, but because he would not sign his name to a vehicle release, knowing that the next driver might die. The non-disclosure agreement was irrelevant because he had no intention of discussing the defect with anyone outside the room, but the vehicle would not leave his shop until the suspension mount was reinforced or replaced and he had verified the repair. He said this with the same factual precision he had used to describe the crack. Vivian tested him. It was reflex, not cruelty, the executive habit of pushing back against resistance. She raised the offer, adding a number that would cover 2 years of operating expenses for his shop. She framed it as business, referencing his daughter, his small garage, and his worn boots. She was not wrong about any of it. She simply misunderstood what the observations meant. Jack did not get angry. He did not lecture her about integrity. He simply repeated the same sentence with the same words. He told her the vehicle was not leaving his shop until it was safe. He said it a 3rd time when she raised the offer again. The repetition was not stubbornness, it was precision. Jack had learned long ago that when you were right about something that mattered, the only thing that weakened your position was adding words that suggested you were not certain. He was certain. Sophie appeared in the doorway again, this time without the water cup, wearing the same pajamas and carrying the blanket from her bed. She looked at Vivian with the unfiltered directness that belonged to children, and she asked a question that stopped both adults in the middle of their negotiation. She asked if the lady was going to sleep in her car. Jack said no. Vivian looked at Sophie and something changed in her face. A shift that suggested she was seeing something between a parent and a child that did not match her experience of the world. She had built a company by making offers that nobody refused, and she had never met a man who refused her 4 times without raising his voice in a garage where a child in pajamas could walk in and ask if she needed a blanket. At 4:30 in the morning, Jack began the work he had refused to hand to anyone else. Called a supplier in the city who owed him a favor from the Prescott days, a man who answered on the 2nd ring despite the hour and who did not ask questions when Jack named the part he needed and the deadline he needed it by. The reinforced suspension mount arrived at 7:15 a.m., delivered by a courier in a van that had left the supplier's warehouse before dawn, and Jack inspected it with the same attention he had applied to the fracture, verifying the part number, the material specification, and the torque rating before he opened the first bolt on the damaged vehicle. Vivian did not sleep. She sat on the folding chair against the far wall, with her coat draped over her shoulders, and she watched. At first, she asked questions about the process. Why did he use that bolt sequence? Why did he set the torque to that specification? Jack answered, with facts rather than philosophy, explaining that the bolt sequence distributed load evenly, and that the torque setting matched the factory specification. The facts added up to a philosophy she had not encountered in her executive world, where speed was rewarded and thoroughness was often dismissed as inefficiency. The conversation shifted as the night became morning. Vivian asked why he had left the high-end restoration world, and Jack's answer was brief. He told her that Sophie needed a father who came home. The complication had come before the choice, in the years of trying to be both places at once, of leaving Prescott at 8 p.m. and arriving home after Sophie was asleep. When Sophie's mother left, the choice became obvious because the alternative had disappeared. He did not say whether he missed the work. The photograph above the bench, hung crooked in its yard sale frame, said what his words did not. Sophie woke at 6, came out in her coat over pajamas, and sat on the stool near the workbench. She did not interfere. She watched her father the way she always had, with the steady confidence of a child who had never been given cause to doubt, and Jack worked around her with the unconscious accommodation of a man who had learned to operate in two worlds simultaneously. Vivian watched Sophie watch Jack, and she saw the small rituals that passed between them without language. The way he handed Sophie a tool without looking, because he knew she was there. The way she handed him a rag before his fingers reached for it. The supplier's part fit precisely. Jack installed the mount, torqued the bolts to specification in the correct sequence, rechecked the alignment with a string line, and test-fitted the underbody panel. The work took 3 hours, and Vivian watched all of it. She did not check her phone. She sat in the folding chair and watched a man work with a thoroughness that her own engineering division had somehow failed to produce, and she understood that the gap between what she had built and what Jack represented was wider than the distance between their respective positions. The test drive did not take long because Jack already knew what the truck would tell him. He drove the SUV on the back road behind the shop, the same kind of uneven surface that had loaded the suspension in the ditch, and he accelerated to speeds that tested the mount without risking the vehicle on roads that were still slick from the storm. Vivian rode in the passenger seat, watching the gauges and feeling the suspension work through the seat, her eyes moving from the speedometer to the road to Jack's hands on the wheel. The vehicle tracked straight. The rear suspension loaded and unloaded symmetrically through the turns, and there was no vibration, no noise from the underbody, no hint that the mount had ever been compromised. Back in the shop, Jack shut off the engine and listened to the cooling metal tick in the silence. Vivian looked at him with an expression he had not seen before, a look that contained the weight of someone who had received information he had not expected and did not know what to do with. She told him, quietly and almost to herself, that their own service centers had run this vehicle through diagnostics 3 weeks ago. They had cleared it. Every sensor had reported within tolerance. Jack did not reply. He turned the SUV around, drove it back to the shop, and parked it in the bay with the same care he applied to every vehicle, because the test drive had confirmed what he already knew, and confirmation required no celebration. Back in the shop, Vivian stood by the workbench and did something she had not done in 15 years. She made an offer without knowing what the response would be. She offered Jack a position that did not exist yet, because she had never met anyone she trusted to define it. Chief of Safety Integrity for the Cross Automotive Group. He would report directly to her, bypassing the engineering hierarchy that had cleared this vehicle. He would have veto power over any vehicle release that his team deemed unsafe, and his team would be built by him, trained by him, operating from protocols that he wrote himself. She told him he could name his own compensation, his own location, his own terms. The weight of the offer was not in its generosity, it was in its specificity. She understood now that the gap between what technology detected and what an experienced mechanic saw was the gap where people died, and she wanted to close that gap. She wanted the person who had taught her that the gap existed, and she was willing to pay whatever he asked. Because she had seen what the alternative cost. Jack didn't answer immediately. He finished cleaning the tools, put away the creeper, and checked that Sophie had eaten the cereal he had left out for her. He lived at a pace that didn't accelerate for opportunity. He named his terms without negotiation, because negotiation would have suggested that the terms were flexible, which they were not. He would consult, he would not relocate. He would review their safety protocols, train their inspectors, and build the checklist that would have caught this defect. He would do it from Millbrook because Sophie was in school here and her stability wasn't available for discussion. He named a fee that was fair but not extravagant, enough to replace the shop's aging hydraulic lift, enough to put something aside for Sophie's future. Vivian agreed to every term without counteroffer. She wrote down his conditions on the back of her business card and signed her name beneath them with a pen that Jack lent her from the workbench. This was not how she normally operated. She simply understood that she had been given a chance to fix something that her own systems had failed to catch. 2 weeks later, a hydraulic lift arrived at Brennan Tow and Repair, delivered by a Cross automotive freight truck. Wah! Jack installed it himself over 3 days, working between the ordinary calls that continued to come in. The shop got a new sign, painted by hand in the same block letters as the old one, and Sophie helped with the brushwork on the lower letters. She still rode in the truck on weekend calls. Jack still woke at 5:30, still made oatmeal, still knocked 3 times on her door. The photograph above the workbench remained crooked. Vivian visited once a month, unannounced, driving a Cross vehicle that Jack inspected before she left. She did not come as a CEO. She came as a student, and their conversations were short and technical. Jack did not become a different man. He did not prove anyone wrong. He simply remained the kind of man who looked under the panel when others did not, who refused money when it cost him his name, and who raised a child who trusted him without question. Some things don't need to be said, they only need to be done. If this story made you think about the competence nobody has noticed yet, maybe it's time to look closer at the work you already do. Subscribe to Dad Legacy Justice, and we'll keep finding the stories that prove quiet work is never invisible. It just waits for the right person to stop moving long enough to see it.